Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. I'm Michael Camilleri. I direct the Dialogue's Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program. We're very pleased today to host a discussion on freedom of expression in the Americas, persistent threats, and emerging challenges. The Inter-American Democratic Charter calls freedom of expression and the press essential components of the exercise of democracy. And indeed, in the decades since democracy was restored in most of the Western Hemisphere, the region has made significant progress in rolling back vestiges of authoritarianism, such as overt censorship and criminal defamation laws. In most countries in the Americas today, there exists a vibrant free press and civil society and strong penetration of social media. Great progress has also been made in expanding government transparency and access to public information. These achievements, to be sure, are to be celebrated. And yet significant challenges remain. In some places, these challenges hark back to darker days, with reporters and protesters persecuted, jailed, even attacked for criticizing their governments. We've seen this vividly in Nicaragua in recent days. In other places, the combination of weak state capacity and powerful criminal actors, some of them linked to public institutions themselves, makes the work of journalism a dangerous and potentially deadly exercise. Last year in the Americas, 22 journalists and media workers were killed, and impunity for these crimes is the rule rather than the exception. We're also seeing emerging challenges, many of them presented by the onset of the digital age, which brings enormous potential for democratizing public debate and opening the public square to traditionally excluded voices, but also opens the door to malicious actors, including those who spread deliberate disinformation or fake news to undermine democracy. So certainly this is a rich and challenging context in which to discuss freedom of expression in the Americas. And we're really delighted to welcome four good friends and experts to help us delve into the topic. Edison Lanza, to my left, is an Uruguayan lawyer and journalist. He's served since 2014 as the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where he's doing tremendous work throughout the hemisphere. Welcome, Edison. Tracy Wilkinson covers foreign affairs for the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times. She has covered wars, crises, and daily life on 3 continents, including as Mexico Bureau Chief. And she received the Maria Moores Cabot Award for her coverage of Latin America. Margot Ewan is North American Director for Reporters Without Borders, also our neighbor here in the office, so I get to see her every day. She appears regularly in U.S. and foreign media. She holds law degrees from the United States and France. One law degree wasn't enough, Margot. I'm not sure. We need to talk about that. And Viviana Kristisevich, former boss, and I'm on my best behavior here, is Executive Director of the Center for Justice and International Law, CEGIL. Vivi, among other things, litigated many of the leading cases before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on freedom of expression, the leading precedent-setting cases before that court. So to begin, I'm going to ask Edison to kind of lead off by giving us an overview of kind of progress and challenges to freedom of expression in the region. Edison's office just published its 2017 annual report, which is a 424-page survey of developments in the region. Edison has promised that he's going to summarize all 424 pages in about 15 minutes. So that must be his journalist training, not his lawyer training. But Edison, look forward to you kind of laying out the ground for our conversation, and then we'll open it up and we'll have a conversation among our panelists about the things that Edison raises and some of the issues that our other panelists are working on and paying attention to. So, Edison, bienvenido.
Muchas gracias.
Great to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I try to resume in 15 minutes and also try to speak in English because in terms of my son, my English is terrible, so I apologize for that. Yes, our report, it's important to say that it covers the 35 countries in the hemisphere. Is the only one report about the international organization in terms of freedom of expression. And we have 20 years of continue follow the situation of freedom of expression in the region. I think that is an important tool for civil society organization, governments, and international bodies to follow the situation of freedom of expression in the region. My first, spotlight and highlight in this annual report, I want to say that the journalists and the media outlets return to the center of the scene. I think that this is an important, optimistic view of the situation, because the role of the media in terms of accountability of the public institution, the fight against corruption in many countries like Brazil, Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Honduras, Panama, and Venezuela. It's a great role and play a important role in the strained democracy in the region, wherever the problems that the media faces. Also, the role played by the journalists and in supporting the functioning of the democracy in many societies and the rule of law, I think that is very clear here in US and also in many countries in Latin America. Faces the rises of the authoritarianism and the problems of the democracy. And in the third times, I think that in this year is especially clear the role of the media in providing quality and accurate information in regards, the problem of the fake news and the many problems that the platforms and the global discussion about that. I think this is important to put in present this. The challenges that the region faces about freedom of expression. Well, the first of all is the violence against journalists and the media workers. Michael said now that 22 journalists was murdered in the region in countries like Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, República Dominicana, Peru, and Colombia. Another aggression is the murders. Is the la punta del iceberg, but it's many other aggressions like threats, kidnappings, attacks to the medias, assaults. We documented 200 journalists attacked in the region and 50 media outlets affected in this regard. The cases, the most cases was in Honduras, Mexico. Mexico have a crisis in terms of violence. 12 media workers was killed in 2017. And also I want to say that at least 3 or 4 of these murderers was, an emblematic journalist. It's not only, the problem at the vulnerable journalists in some region, but it's, a very grave problem for democracy and for access of information in the region, because journalists like Miroslava Breach in Chihuahua or Javier Valdez in Sinaloa is the greatest journalist, an investigator about crime, the link between crimes and politics, and this year is particularly important in this regards. In Colombia, we have many, human rights defenders killed, after the sign of the peace process, and also an indigenous journalist was killed in defense of the land and the covers on these conflicts. In Guatemala, also follow a very, dangerous country to play to working journalists with 8 cases. Peru, we have a documentalist also killed this year. In República Dominicana, 2 journalists that was on the air in the radio was killed in the first moment that he called for news. Really, this is a very huge problem in the region. The causes of this violence were the journalists covered crime, organized crime, political corruption, or represented critical voices in their local community. and at least 2 journalists killed assaulted in the context of social protest. Or yesterday, we know the terrible notice of the journalist in Nicaragua that was killed in the precise moment that covered a protest. Other new trends in 2017 is the political polarization and stigmatization over the press. I think that this new era of political figures and high-level authorities have encouraged the polarization of the media and promoted stigmatization discourses towards the different media outlets and journalists. This trend, it's present in US, Colombia, Bolivia, and obviously the follow of this practice in Venezuela that have had many years. The characteristics of this trend is describe the media as part of the opposition or political partnership, erode the public trust in journalists as institution of the democracy, and statements and attacks against the press are particularly serious and intensify the risks of threat and violence against the journalists, in particular in the country we have a context of violence. I think the demonstration and social protest, it's a new big issue in the region. During 2017, demonstration and protests were a key factor for the exercise of freedom of expression in the hemisphere, I think. But the excessive use of the force in several states against the right to demonstration and protest, with violent dispersion and with journalist killer or threats, it's especially danger in Venezuela, Honduras, now Nicaragua, and so on, and other threats like surveillance and different kind of repression, like in Mexico and also here in the US. We documented also, the threats about the indirect forms of censorship that in the region, still is a big problem, especially in the use of the money of the state or the resources of the state to press for the media outlet or, punish the critics' media outlets. This is an important problem I think in many countries in the Americas. But in Mexico, we had a in loco visit, and the government, buy millions and millions of public advertising to influence the media. We had some, advances and discussion about this. For example, the Supreme Court of Mexico ruled an important decision, and determined that the government or the Congress should be pass a law to regulate this form of assignation of money to the press. And in this morning, the Senate is discussing a new law. Mm-hmm. Argentina take some measures to limit the possibility of the executive branch to put money in the media, and Uruguay now is discussing also a new public advertising law. Then I think that this is an important tool issue to follow in this year. And also obviously the new challenges that present and faces the internet and freedom of expression. Several states in the region have regulated the use and access to the internet as a response to preventing cybercrime and hate crimes in ambiguous and vague forms, and this represents a threat to the expression of public interests. Also, I need to put in present the problem that the Federal Communication Commission here revoked the principle of net neutrality in the United States. It's now a discussion about the content of this the change, and many state congresses passes law to enforce the net neutrality. But net neutrality is one of the structural principles of the internet that we know, and then I think this is an important issue to follow also this year. And I think that another problem in this sense is the lack of legislation on the limits of the power to monitor and surveillance private communication in all the region. And finally, to close with an optimistic vision of the future, I think that it's important to know that the judiciary advances and play a very nice role in the region in terms of fight against impunity of the crime against journalists. We have 3 cases, obviously about recently cases, but the first 3 cases in Colombia, Guatemala, and Paraguay, who the judiciary, identify and sanction the responsibilities for the crime of journalists. I think that is a trend that we need to enforce. Nevertheless, the region continues to have high levels of impunity, and also to protect the sources of the journalists and you discriminalize the cases of public expression. We have a systematic report about the main decision in the high courts in the region, and I think that we have there, a good trends to follow. In the executive branch, I want to highlight the radical change made by the new president of Ecuador towards the past, government in the relation between government and the press. I think that is a very important change to demonstrate that it's possible to make a step to improve the protection of the journalists, and the normalization of the relationship between the president and the media, for example, in Argentina. And in the legislative institution, I want to destack the access to information law in Bahamas. We have now 24 countries in the region with access to information law. The establishment of the enforcement authority for access to information in Argentina, that, the head of this office is Eduardo Bertoni, is a former Special Rapporteur. A new law on protection of journalist sources in Canada, and a bill to lift the secret in the Valech Commission in Chile to remove the obstacles to investigate the cases of human rights violation in the past. This is a few ideas for our annual report, and thank you for the attention.
Great, thanks. Edison, that's terrific, and it really is a great basis on which to have this conversation. Your son, your English is excellent.
No.
Tracy, let me turn to you. You've reported from all over the region, going back to the Contra Wars in the 1980s. When you hear Edison kind of run through the contemporary challenges, the areas of progress, do things feel like they've changed? Does it feel like more of the same? What's your reaction to kind of his overview?
Yeah, no, I think things have changed, and thank you for mentioning the Contra War. You now know I'm older than everyone in this room, but that is where my career started in journalism, pretty much was in Latin America, the Contra Wars, the El Salvador War. Mm-hmm. And, by way of context, I worked there the 80s, the 90s. Mid-90s, I was transferred to the other side of the planet where I covered the Balkans and the Middle East. Came back to Latin America, to Mexico specifically in 2008, and yes, things had changed dramatically. The rules, well, obviously the country had changed, but the rules of journalism had changed substantially. What used to be great about Mexico is you could plop into any little town and sort of hang out and listen and observe and absorb, and you couldn't do that anymore come 2008. Yes, reporters had always been exposed to some kind of violence, but by then, by 2008, it was, journalists were getting killed, harassed, kidnapped. The government had embarked on this war against drug trafficking, and it had become extremely dangerous. And we, as journalists, suddenly had to take all kinds of precautions that we had not done before. In fact, we called it Baghdad rules, because we literally had to plot where we were going, when we were going, have a network of people de confianza, people we could trust in the local places, not advertising our presence, keeping a very low profile, extra antenna up at all times. So there was no more of that spontaneity. I think we always got the story, but it just always took a lot more preparation, discretion, and time. So we got the stories, but it just took a lot longer, and it was more dangerous. I mean, I literally one time, maybe 2009, 10, I wanted to go to Tamaulipas, which was a black hole in a state, as you all know, in the northeast corner. And none of the foreign press ever went there, and we didn't really know what was going on. It was a state completely under the control of the Gulf and eventually Zeta cartels. The man who was supposed to be the next governor was assassinated broad daylight with his 15-member, or how many ever it was, security detail. So I literally flew in the morning, went straight to the one place where a family was. Their son had been an oil worker who had been disappeared, interviewed the family, went back to the airport. A few people who I wanted to talk to came to the airport to talk to me, and I left. I flew back to Mexico City. I didn't even spend the night. I mean, that's something I wouldn't have, done before, but it was necessary. Now, several months later, as my confidence and my network grew, I went back to Reynosa in Tamaulipas and spent an entire week and interviewed a lot of people. People did not want to be seen with a foreign reporter. You had to do clandestine meetings in churches, meetings in basements, meetings in the hotel. And then I wrote a very long story about the victims, and I didn't name a single victim. And, we as journalists always want to have named characters, sources. But in a way, I thought it kind of expanded the universality of the suffering and also reflected the terror that people did not want to be quoted. And so I had chapters of the commuter who talked about how dangerous the roads were and how you had to calculate when you could travel where, the mother who feared sending her kid off to school every morning, whether he would return or not, and that sort of thing. They were all real people and real quotes, but I had them, they almost became these universal figures. Anyway, point is, different ways to report, and always being so careful, always having eyes in the back of the head. We were around Ayotzinapa and Iguala when the students were kidnapped, and noticing you're being followed, or noticing someone is listening to your conversation, just noticing all of these things, which seem minor, but you didn't used to have to do that so much in Mexico, and you do now. The second point I wanted to make, though, is that whatever we, as the foreign press, the international press, endured, it is nothing compared to what the Mexican journalists experience. And, we can, in theory, always leave. We always calculated, and this is probably a false sense of security, but we always calculated, well, they won't kill a foreign journalist. It's too much, hell to pay if you kill an American. And so we kind of felt a little immune, which is probably foolish. But the Mexican journalists have no recourse. Their families are threatened. The bad guys know where their children go to school, where their spouses work, all of these things. And so that led to a lot of self-censorship by Mexican journalists. The only way, silence is survival, as one editor told me. The only way to survive was just not to cover what was happening in your town. And that's sad. That is loss of accountability, loss of civic activism. It really, turns these places into black holes, and you don't know what's happening. Initially, as Edison mentioned, it was minor reporters, reporters who no one really knew, and it was out in Veracruz or in the mountains or these places where it didn't have as much of a repercussion, but gradually, and again, as the impunity proved itself unbreakable, very few of these cases are ever investigated. The bad guys started killing more prominent journalists. There was the woman from from Proceso in Veracruz, whose name I'm blanking on right now, was killed. And then Javier Valdez. Javier Valdez, my very good friend. He had been my teacher in Sinaloa. I would go to Sinaloa. He would take me under his wing, take me out to where Chapo was born, take me to the cantina, take me all over. A very, very dear friend. And he was such a prominent journalist, had won international awards, had written books. He really thought himself invincible, protected, that he was so prominent that they wouldn't touch him. And that's true until it's not. And I'd already moved back here, but he was leaving, I'm sure you all know the story, he was leaving his office one morning, and just a few blocks from his office, he was at a stoplight, they pulled him out of the car in the middle of the street, middle of the day, shot him 12 times. The name of his publication is Rio 12 times, and his crime is that, well, I think after El Chapo Guzman was arrested, there was such a power struggle going on that these younger, less scrupulous, if you can use that word, drug gangsters were, in this power struggle, and Javier was writing about that, but he also wrote about the connections, the nexo between the cartels and politics and the business elite, and that's something he wrote about for a long time. And I think those two things sealed his fate. As you say, as Edison said, these were emblematic journalists now who are being killed. And because the impunity is so great, journalists feel like I'll get killed and nothing will come of it. Now, just last night, Mexico announced that it had arrested a suspect in Javier's murder. Do you think the international community, and more important, the Mexicans, will believe this, will find it a credible investigation? Probably not, because that's how low the confidence is. But we'll see. I don't want to prejudge. And the third point I wanted to make is this really goes beyond, we're talking about the violence, but it really goes beyond violence. A lot of the bad guys, as I've been calling them, are not the drug gangsters. They're the politicians, or they're the police. They are in cahoots, often, the cartels with the local authorities, or they're one and the same, or, whatever. So less than the overt violence is this more insidious pressure, intimidation, and that, again, as I mentioned, leads to self-censorship. A lot of the publications, especially in the states, rely on government advertising for their survival, and so they can't offend a governor who often instructs what to cover and what not to cover. And the cartels do the same. So where it ends and the other begins, it's hard to say. But this crew, particularly the pre-government, when Enrique Peña Nieto came into power, they managed to somehow portray themselves as a new Mexico, young, dynamic, U.S.-educated leaders, and initially got very favorable press, mostly from, I will say in self-interest, the East Coast press, and less so from us. But initially, they really were getting this good press, but they turned out to be as manipulative and as corrupt, I'll say, as all of their predecessors. And I learned when one government press officer was leaving, he showed me the file they had on the foreign press. And they had each of our names, picture, some of our stories, and a rating on how favorable or unfavorable we were reporting on their government. It was pretty creepy. And then, what was I going to say? So I think the PRI has been a master at that, at intimidation. Again, a lot of the parties do it. I'm not seeing like one, except that they're in power right now. And I think that has exacerbated, it's created this climate where violence can be committed, where nothing will be investigated seriously, and you can kill a journalist and get away with it, essentially. And in the more, as I say, insidious and less obvious, I remember one time the government, the Presidencia would call a press conference. So we'd go thinking we could ask questions, because that's what a press conference is. We'd go, the spokesman would read a statement, and that was it. So one day I said to Peña Nieto's top PR guy, I said, "You're calling these press conferences, and these are not you're not allowing us to ask questions." And he said, well, if we let you ask questions, you might talk about something we don't want to talk about. And so I said, touche, that's the point. So one way or another, they do everything they can to control the press. So my hat is off to those journalists and many, many courageous Mexican journalists who do find ways. It's often now through internet publications, not through the traditional press, that they do get the story out. There's some great journalism going on, but it's always at a certain amount of risk.
Great, thanks, Tracy. That's a terrific kind of ground level view of how these challenges are lived by journalists. Vivi, let me turn to you and ask you a similar question about human rights defenders, because we often equate the freedom of expression discussion to a journalist or media worker conversation, but obviously human rights defenders play a similar role in terms of exercising freedom of expression in the cause of informing society and holding governments to account. What does this look like? You work with human rights defenders all throughout the Americas. What are the obstacles they're facing? Edison mentioned social protest and violence against, certainly in the wake of the peace accord in Colombia, as particular concerns. But what are the obstacles, both legal and otherwise, to the effective exercise of the defense of freedom of human rights in the region?
When I was hearing Tracy tell her story, I was thinking of how similar it seemed to the story of human rights defenders in our region, because I think, and I think that human rights defenders always felt like the weakest link, you know, like maybe the Baghdad rules applied to them a little bit before than to the journalists, because the journalists thought that they were a bit more insulated from the wrath of the captured state or illegal networks or these power actors that have been doing going after different alternative voices. And I think there's a continuum of repression and silencing that goes on in parts of the region, especially when you have mobilized civil society and organizations, sometimes alternative media, sometimes journalists working for the mainstream media, human rights organization trying to do the right thing, sometimes victims movements, you know, saying, okay, this is what's happening. I mean, you can see it with Ayotzinapa, but you can also discover it through looking at Marielle Franco in Rio de Janeiro, or the dynamics of the death of some of the indigenous leaders in the countryside in the region. If you look at the numbers themselves of human rights defenders and journalists killed in the region, it's around like 2/3 of those killed in the world. Last year is at least 170 human rights defenders, mainly people that are trying to denounce institutional corruption, the capturing of state power by illegal groups, but there's a lot of killings that are going on in the countryside of indigenous human rights defenders, and that are at the forefront of the struggle against some of the predatory practices of states and companies and economic actors in the countryside in the Americas. I think that is fueled by impunity and by a continuum of impunity, because it's not only the killings, it's also the threats, the different types of attacks, and the subtle and not so subtle ways of silencing people physically in the analog way and the digital realities, you know, like what we're seeing these days in Nicaragua. I think that we've raised where if worse gets, if you look at the organizations have put forward for human rights defenders and for journalists, the levels of impunity are over 98%. And when you get some level of justice, it's at such a low level generally, because I don't know how much you've been looking at the logics of organized networks, but generally you have somebody that gives an order, but the person that executes that order is generally a sicario, So sometimes you can get the author of the crime, but that's, just the lowest length. So, and there are these trends in terms of the repressive patterns of states in dealing with human rights defenders and journalists on the ground that are of major concern. I think the Nicaraguan situation in the last few days illustrates it very well. The numbers vary in terms of the dead, but ICRC was saying, 2 or 3 days ago that there were 9. Confidential said yesterday that they have a list of 19. We have a list from a couple of human rights NGOs of 28 verified dead. The numbers of illegally detained have grown there. It's a similar toolkit that was applied in Honduras. So, I think, I don't know, I can keep on talking for a long time about this. This is my bread and butter, but.
I feel like the impunity conversation probably has a little ways to run. Margot, this conversation tends to be very Latin America focused, but you're looking at these issues in the US and Canada and the Caribbean. Very close to here, we have a president who has called the media the enemy of the American people. How concerned should we be about free speech in countries where we have strong constitutional guarantees and strong legal institutions, and maybe a few years ago we would have thought that the issues weren't quite so urgent and acute. How worried are you?
Pretty worried. I would actually like to come back to the U.S., save the best for last. But in terms of strong constitutional protections, if you take Canada as an example, and Edison mentioned, they adopted a federal shield law unanimously, actually, in federal parliament last year, because there was such an outcry over what was happening in Canada. You had at least 7 journalists had been under police surveillance in Quebec. It was discovered in 2016. One of the journalists surveilled had been under police surveillance for about 6 months that year, and then other journalists were discovered to have been under police surveillance back in 2013. And it wasn't because they were suspected of committing any crimes, but the police forces wanted to find out who their sources were within their own ranks. So that really sat ill with people in Canada. They were up in arms over that situation. But there was also a journalist covering protests against a hydroelectric dam project in Newfoundland and Labrador who was arrested, or who had an arrest warrant out for his coverage of the protest, and is still facing civil and criminal charges just for covering a protest. So kind of like the North Dakota Access Pipeline type issue, but in Canada. And then the other major case is a journalist working for Vice News. His name is Ben McCoo. And he's fighting a production order from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to hand over his communications between himself and a source who's an alleged ISIS fighter. And that case is going before the Supreme Court next month. So that's kind of appalling in a country like Canada, which is a large democracy, and maybe many of you in this room might be surprised at these issues that are currently faced in that country. Reporters Without Borders downgraded them about 14 places on our World Press Freedom Index between 2015 and 2017 because of these issues. And we were very happy that this new federal shield law was adopted unanimously, is quite important, but also that there was a commission of inquiry established in Quebec to investigate these journalists who were put under surveillance. What's problematic, though, is that one of the journalists who was under surveillance, a famous investigative reporter in Quebec, Marie-Maud Denis, working for Radio Canada, the largest publicly owned media outlet in Canada, was ordered last month by a court in Quebec to reveal her sources, even though the law is now in force and would apply to her situation. So you still have a long way to go in Canada to actually make sure that journalist sources are protected and that journalists are also not facing charges for covering important events like protests. And when you look at the Caribbean, you have a different type of situation. You have strong democratic systems put in place, and you have local press who is unfortunately struggling from the economic limits of what kind of money that they can make doing their job, and a lot of political opposition tries to influence these young journalists who are really not making a very satisfactory living doing their job. But what is really concerning in the Caribbean, at least the English-speaking Caribbean, which I focus on in our office here, is the trend of cybercrime legislation being adopted, and it is quite vague and broad, and it sometimes gets copied and pasted by different countries in the region. So you had one adopted 2 years ago by St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which was very vague. And then we saw that same draft text initially circulate in Trinidad and Tobago. They've luckily updated it and made it a lot less vague. And that text is still being debated. But in Guyana, for example, you have a cybercrime bill that is the worst that I've seen since my time working at Reporters Without Borders, where both whistleblowers and journalists or media outlets that publish information that would be collected illegally, so to speak, would face criminal persecution. And the importance of these laws or draft laws is that criminal defamation is still on the books in many of these countries. And though it may not regularly get used, if you're going to extend that to online expression, then you have more repression and more self-censorship that results from that. So that's, currently what's going on in the Caribbean. But what we're also seeing since the first full term of our American president is this desire to legislate on fake news in the Caribbean. I haven't seen a draft bill yet. However, given the fact that cybercrime legislation is something that is circulating now, I would be worried that such, copy-paste practices with a fake news draft legislation that might be equally vague and overly broad would also sweep the region, and that would be quite dangerous, given that defamation is criminalized. But going back to the U.S. now, we currently rank the United States 43 out of 180 countries in our World Press Freedom Index, which is very low for the country of the First Amendment and the standard to which this country holds itself. So obviously, before Trump took office, there were a lot of problems that have pre-existed in the United States. President Obama did not have a very great reputation for protecting press freedom, very controlling of the message coming out of the White House. There was a scandal involving subpoenaing of AP journalists' phone records under that administration. And also journalists were at times arrested covering protests. Maybe it was Black Lives Matter protests, but also North Dakota Access Pipeline protests. Multiple journalists arrested there, and some are still facing criminal charges. So that is kind of the climate that predated the Trump presidency. And what we started seeing during his campaign was kind of a disregard for press freedom as a fundamental pillar of democracy, starting to target individual journalists or media outlets that he didn't like the way that they might have portrayed his campaign. And that continued into his term as president. But when he started saying what he had been saying during the campaign as the president of the United States, that had a lot more influence over, I think, the people of this country who might have already been distrusting of the media. And so we have seen more arrests than we normally see of journalists just in the field covering protests. Most of the arrests occurred while they're covering protests, but also instances of physical violence from individuals or threats of physical violence. And now we're seeing online threats kind of increase and be more diversified in the types of online threats we're seeing. Just as one example, when the Parkland shooting happened a couple of months ago, some journalists were impersonated on Twitter while they were trying to cover the shooting, which was a national story, very important. And because they were impersonated, somebody created a fake account with the same journalist's name for the Miami Herald, I think it was. This person was no longer able to talk to sources. They didn't want to talk to her because they thought that she was biased in her reporting given this impersonation attempt. So that's also occurring in the United States. But also this has an impact abroad because we're seeing traditional authoritarian leaders feel, I think, emboldened by this outward disdain for press freedom. And there have even been, taking on of Trump's phrases of fake news or, using other insults that he has levied against the press or individual journalists. I think he was on his Asia trip at the end of last year sitting with the Philippine President Duterte, who, made a joke about journalists being spies. And I think Trump just laughed. And this is someone, Duterte is someone who's called journalists sons of a bitch, excuse my French, and who's also talked about how they might deserve to be murdered in a country where they actually are murdered. So that's really dangerous. But we also see a Trump effect, if you will, in traditional democracies. We see this attempt to legislate on fake news. There's a draft bill in France currently underway. I think legislation was adopted in Germany recently, which can have very negative consequences on free press and free flow of information online. So we're really seeing a decline in the leadership role that the United States has traditionally played in press freedom protections around the world because we're no longer able to say that we are leading by prime example.
Thanks, Margot. Edison, let me come back to you on one of those issues, which is this the issue of stigmatization of the press by political leaders, which is prominent in your annual report. It's not a new challenge. There's inter-American court jurisprudence, I think going back to Chavez's days in Venezuela. Certainly this was an issue with Alba Uribe in Colombia. It was an issue with Correa in Ecuador. Trump didn't invent the, and there is sort of a natural tension always, I think, between political leaders and the media. The question is sort of where's the line? Where's the line between a political leader's own freedom of expression and desire and right to sort of push back against and promote their own version of events, and something that crosses the line into things we should be concerned about that aren't consistent with the respect for free speech that we're entitled, I think, to demand of people in that sort of position. So where do you, as the rapporteurship, where do you see that line situated?
Yeah, of course, it's not new. I think that the Latin American caudillos or leaders, learn of the rest of the world what is the way to, stigmatize and find the press like enemy of the people. No, I feel that in the inter-American standards, obviously a leadership have the right to freedom of expression also, and have the right to criticize the work of the press, but at the same time that they have the right, have a responsibility under the public. And like a president or the high level functionary, the due to be accuracy, to be precise, to be careful, because they are now in the age of the social network. They have millions of followers, and they have the possibility to stigmatize somebody, journalist or human rights defender, and the fanatics go against him or her, no? And also, it's important to promote an environment to practice freedom of expression and independent media. Democracy is not only, the formal institution. It's also an environment to discuss, to have a better public debate. And I think that it's this kind of, figure that use in democracy, this kind of rhetoric, degrade the democracy, degrade the public debate, put on risk and more risk the person who defends human rights or the journalist, and it's a deliberate way to do politics, and this is the problem, no? And also, in the other hand, when you have the violence, the environment of violence that we face, we talk about that here. The public figure have the oblige, to condemn the violence, not to promote the violence against journalists. And I think that this kind of rhetoric is promote more violence and open the door to put in more risk la difícil situación, ¿no? of the human rights defenders and journalists.
Great. Tracy, I want to shift the conversation a little bit to kind of the solution side. And you, I think, were quite clear in your initial remarks about the precautions you were taking as an individual reporter in places like Reynosa, presumably with the backing of your newspaper and with the resources that come with being a foreign correspondent, which wouldn't always be available to local reporters in some of these places. You mentioned some of the online journalism that's happening as an outlet that some journalists have found to be able to kind of get their stories out. You talked a little bit also about the measures that governments are or are not taking to protect journalists. In Mexico, we've seen the creation of a special prosecutor's office. We've seen the creation of a protection program for journalists. So, and yet, it doesn't seem like these things are making the situation a whole lot better. In fact, your experience suggests that things were substantially worse in your kind of latter stint in Mexico in particular. So, I mean, when you look at these issues, where does the responsibility lie for enabling journalists to do their work in adequate conditions, and what solutions have you seen at these different levels that may offer some promise?
Well, in Mexico, and to a lesser extent parts of Central America, there are a lot of networks of journalists who have formed, Periodistas de a pie, and others who are teaching themselves security and inviting experts to come in and teach them, and organizations like Reporters Without Borders, CPJ, that support them from outside. And part of the reason they have to do it themselves is their newspapers don't back them. La Reforma, Universal, these big newspapers owned by very, the elite, not journalists, but an elite that doesn't care and does not back up their journalists. So they have to kind of do it on their own, autodidactic, as they say, and but with support from international groups, and increasingly, I hope, some national groups. My husband was the CPJ representative in Mexico, and he literally sat down with President Calderon to get the killing of a journalist to be made a federal crime, which it wasn't until then, which entailed changing the Constitution. And they did. They did enact that law, and now it's a federal crime. You mentioned the Special Prosecutor's Office, but that's not had a huge impact. When I was still there, and it's been 2 years now, I think the Special Prosecutor's Office had taken up 1 or 2 cases max. And a lot of time, and there is this protection mechanism, but often the journalist finds that the people providing the protections, it's the local police, and they don't feel safe with that. The city police in Mexico City are better and a little more trusted, but there are just very few guarantees. But again, these networks are formed. They've got ways to alert each other. There are alert systems in place. Everyone has WhatsApp and, is able to communicate. So, a very grassroots way of organizing security. So that's what I see happening. And, again, with the backing, support, and pushing of some of the international organizations, I think is the only way.
Vivi, in the cases that you and Sahil litigate, oftentimes involving people who have been killed for the work they're doing, you have had to do sort of an autopsy of a lot of these cases. You go in, you look at the case files, you often diagnose what was done wrong or what failed to be done in challenging the cases at the international level. You've also been active in trying to develop a protocol to look at ways in which threats against human rights defenders might be better investigated. So what are some of the lessons that you've been able to take, both from the cases in which things have gone wrong, in which impunity has reigned at the domestic level, but also now thinking sort of proactively about what investigators should be doing right in order to advance these investigations?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the issues that comes up again and again is this relationship of preventative mechanisms or measures, creating an enabling environment where people can work, and the links of that with protection mechanisms and investigations. And I think that that's something that sometimes states and state authorities have this idea of looking at these parts of a policy that should be looked at more systematically as separate, distinct things that will solve the problem. And so they think, oh, well, if I give, and the Colombian case is paradigmatic of this. It's like, I'll put a lot of money in creating all these armored cars and having people, surrounded by bodyguards. It's a nightmare for any journalist and human rights defender to be surrounded by that. I'm not saying that it's not necessary to create those protection mechanisms, but they are a piece of a broader puzzle. So looking at that broader puzzle is critical. And one of the parts that in the autopsy of the real autopsy of the cases that we do is that we realize that if you look at cases individually, even if you are trying to untangle some of the patterns and workings of illegal groups or state authorities that are involved in the killing, you have a ceiling. You have the ceiling of the reactive investigation from one case trying to unveil broader patterns. So we came to the conclusion after a lot of cases and thinking and talking to others that domestic investigations and international investigations have to be able to pattern, to look at broader patterns of conduct and harassment in order to unveil and to dismount not only the sicario, but the networks that allowed that killing, those that surveilled and allowed for the Pegasus thing that paid for that gave allowed the sicario to know where this person would be at what time, the person that put the money, that gave the order, those that allowed the silences and actions that are generally around these crimes, because these are not simple crimes. These are sometimes sophisticated crimes that involved groups of people, and in order to more radically pull and create an incentive for protection and for justice, you need to be able to unveil those patterns. And that's what we're trying to do now. We're working on a project. I mean, we're working in several countries with the UN and prosecutors' office and human rights defenders and journalists with some of the prosecutors' office domestically to create protocols for investigation. But more broadly, we're looking worldwide at not only in trying to address this issue, we're trying to create a protocol that would look not only at what the prosecutors have to do, but also at some of these criminal policies that have to be in place or public policies that have to be in place in order to better protect and better investigate. So this is an ongoing project. We sincerely appreciate the involvement, the broader involvement of our community. And so Edison has actually participated in one of the first discussions. We're moving forward. In the next 2 years, we hope to come up with something that will be a contribution, a significant contribution, we hope, to our community.
Terrific. Margot, you work on these issues of violence and impunity. RSF does all over the world. Are there any best practices, any good examples that you can highlight that would be informative for our region?
Well, I'm not sure it would be a best practice, but I do want to say that recently in Mexico, this special prosecutor's office has made several arrests, which is quite unusual, in the murder of Carlos Dominguez Rodriguez, who was stabbed to death in January in Tamaulipas. I'm not sure I pronounced Tamaulipas. And his son came to the United States. We hosted him here in Washington, D.C. We had a number of meetings with the State Department, Congress, with Edison Lanza to kind of discuss, what can we do here from the U.S. To apply pressure on the Mexican government. Within weeks of our visit, I think 6 arrests were made in his father's murder, which is quite unusual for this prosecutor's office. And the believed to be mastermind of the crime has fled. And so I think that can highlight, that despite the decline of respect for press freedom from the White House, that there's still the capacity for the United States to influence and exert pressure. And so RSF is constantly working with the U.S. government, with Congress, with State Department, to apply pressure where we can in other countries around the world where journalists have been murdered and impunity either reigns or is kind of installing itself now. So think about the European Union, which has seen some countries, or some of its accession countries, have seen violence or murder, targeted killings of journalists in the past several months. So Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, followed by a Slovak journalist, and then an attempted assassination by car bomb of a journalist in Montenegro recently. So what we're really seeing here is a deterioration of the safety for journalists who cover corruption, because all these journalists were covering corruption, and the risk that those journalists are putting themselves into is increasing. And so what RSF tries to do is work with other organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists on applying pressure and calling for independent investigations. Perhaps that might involve other countries coming in and assisting with investigation. But when we publish our reports, when we publish our World Press Freedom Index, which our new one is coming out tomorrow, if anyone would be interested in reading it. So based on data collected in 2017, we're using it as an advocacy tool. And it has an impact to, have a number associated with a given country on this index. In Canada, for example, when we downgraded them to 22, which is still a fairly good ranking, when they used to be in the top 10, members of parliament were screaming at Trudeau with our index data, saying, what are you going to do to address this issue? And lo and behold, we have legislation adopted later that year. And we've even had, positive traction from Turkey in past years when we ranked them low. And, they called us and asked us, why was the ranking so low? We released, foreign journalists in prison, and we said, well, you still have local journalists in prison. So, those kinds of instances of public advocacy can have a strong impact And then, of course, we have local correspondents working in 130 countries around the world. Some of them are official, some are unofficial, depending on safety concerns. But we do have a representative in Mexico that is very essential in working with the families of the journalists killed. And so we try to work on the ground with local actors, but also at the international level, and that includes all the way up to the United Nations, where we push for a campaign to appoint a special representative for the safety of journalists that would be in New York and have a political role with the weight and the capacity to act, the political weight and capacity to act quickly in terms of violence and killing of journalists.
Great, thank you. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left, so at this point I'd like to just open it up to you all for questions. Please wait for the microphone. Is this the microphone? No, wait. Introduce yourself, and if your question's directed at somebody specifically, please mention that.
Joseph Dickens with Internews Network. My question is to Viviana. Can you speak more on some of the trends in terms of regional coordination between authoritarian governments to suppress freedom of expression?
Any others?
Of coordination amongst authoritarian governments? I think there are trends of repression of different types of governments from the right and the left, and we cover Honduras and Nicaragua and many other countries in the region. So I think that some of these patterns go beyond the ideological divide. I think there is some sharing of information that has had an impact on some of the limitations of human rights defenders and journalists entering some of the countries, and I see that in Nicaragua and Venezuela, for example. I'm not sure whether they share more than that. I also see patterns of norms on cybersecurity that are very concerning, and anti-terrorism legislation, which is also kind of ridiculous in our region. Like, I was checking Honduran, the new criminal code of Honduras on terrorism that can have an impact, and Edison talks about that in his report. If you look at the punishment for terrorism, it's like 40 to 50 years for creating uncertainty, and I don't know, it's a very vague, overbroad text, but taking the life of somebody, so homicide is 15 to 20. So like there's a lot of overbroad legislation that is cropping up in different countries. Some are ideologically similar, some are not, but I think there's I don't know if it is like an epidemic thing or contagious effect. It's like the flu for some of these repressive measures. And I think cybersecurity and some of the issues of how people are reacting to fake news or privacy concerns in the internet, and issues of organized crime and violence is a bit concerning from the social mobilization take on freedom of expression, but also I think for journalists.
If I could add to that too, there's also the sale of surveillance equipment from democratic countries to authoritarian regimes like Bahrain, Egypt.
Yes, yes.
And that has a direct impact.
Mexico. I'm not sure whether Brazil and Argentina were also included in the ones that were sold technology. That's really very concerning.
Yes.
Could
I ask a question? I wanted to, Margot, you mentioned working with the State Department, and I'm interested in that. I cover the State Department, and I've never covered a U.S. government before, so maybe this is quite typical. But I've been taken at how inconsistent they are in denouncing violence against journalists. They will go to great lengths to denounce some violence, but not others. For example, they won't denounce the killing by Israel of a Palestinian journalist. Well, You know, there are lots
I
of,
don't know why. But.
yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. But I bet you $1 million they will come out with a condemnation of Nicaragua, of a journalist being killed in Nicaragua, and they barely a peep about Honduras, about journalists, human rights defenders, you know, all of the political violence in Honduras, because Juan Orlando is buddy-buddy with a lot of Republicans and Trump. So it just, I'm glad that you could still work with the State Department, but I'm just, I've been taking, maybe this is typical, but I've been kind of taken aback that it's not consistent. It just seems like a journalist is killed, that's bad, period.
Well, so we don't necessarily work with Heather Newart, who is responsible for these statements, or at least her people are. When they do come out, they are very strong. We are thrilled to have them because they are important, coming from the executive of the U.S. government. But there's a lot that the State Department does behind the scenes. So collect data from different organizations to compile their annual human rights reports per country. And Reporters Without Borders shares our data on press freedom around the world with the staff that compiles those reports. But also we work a lot on Mexico, and we share information about how violent and dangerous the situation is for journalists in that area. I haven't personally had the opportunity yet to work on Honduras, but if it came up, I would still feel confident that we could communicate with them about that, what's going on in that region for journalists. And there's, recently been some journalists from Mexico detained in the U.S. while seeking asylum. So Emilio Gutierrez Soto, and now there's this other journalist who was arrested in Memphis while covering a migrant rights rally, and he's from El Salvador. And even though all charges were dropped against him, he then was taken immediately into detention with an aim to be deported. And we've actually worked quite closely with the State Department on this in support of those journalists. And when I say in support of, I just mean that there is a desire from the people working in DRL, Department of Human Rights and Labor, to share data that they've gotten from RSF, from CPJ, from other organizations about just how many journalists are killed in Mexico and why it's actually quite dangerous. It would be very dangerous for these journalists to be deported back. So there's a lot that happens maybe more behind the scenes or more under the radar, even though when statements do come out from the State Department that condemn violence, of course we welcome them. Of course they should be for every country.
But you do feel like they're listening.
I do feel like they are listening, and I think in the past, we've worked with the spokesperson's department on Azerbaijan, for example, and there was a journalist from Azerbaijan who was detained at one point, and then the State Department came out with a really strong statement, and there was also action in Congress, and that journalist was then released from custody. So there is an impact that can come from both public and private, or behind lower profile actions.
I will just say that I see at least one State Department representative in the room. I won't put him on the spot, but but he's welcome to ask for the floor if he wants it.
No, it's in relation with the question that in the first 10 years of this cycle, defamation laws and the Zacato laws, it's the form to punish the expression in regards to public interest. And now the crime law is moving for other, issues. Broad also, bags and with the same potential like cybercrime, terrorism, subversion, and so on. And this is a trend in many countries. And also I want to mention the situation in Cuba that we know don't say anything, but we try to have a good report this year and the past year in our annual report, because this kind of vague and broad law is very useful actually used in Cuba to reprime human rights defenders and journalists and the lack of journalists that they have. And in fact, we passed the first case in many years about a group of intellectuals and activists in Cuba that face 5 years of prison about subversion, the figure of subversion. It's an old case, but it's international justice to put in present this issue in Cuba also.
Mike? I wanted to say one thing because it's just an early warning, something that I didn't say before, but because of the 3 journalists, Ecuadorian journalists that were killed by the FARC dissidents in Colombia. We were tracking the numbers of the human rights defenders and killed in Colombia. And if the trend continues this year, I think half of the human rights defenders killed in the world will be killed in Colombia. So, and if what we're seeing with people mobilized in different regions in Colombia is starting to affect journalists, I think that you should just keep an eye on that because it might end up marrying.
Any more questions? Maybe I'll ask the last one then. And I wanted to come back to this issue of fake news because, Edison, this is something you've worked on pretty deeply in the past year with the other Special Rapporteurs from the UN and Europe and Africa. Released a long kind of joint statement laying out some principles to think about the issue. And now we're starting to see, in the context of elections in Latin America, both a real sort of threat from deliberate malicious disinformation, but also responses from governments in some cases, or at least proposed regulations and legislation that that itself potentially threatens freedom of expression. So, can you give us just as a close here a sense of kind of what we should expect, what we should be looking out for, and what you think the appropriate response is to this kind of emerging challenge for democratic debate in the region?
Yeah, we released a joint declaration because we had a huge concern about, when you have a new terms and new possibility, the politics to restrict the flow of information and to take down information that don't want to continue to flow. It's a very important threat. And we say many things about that. In the joint declaration have many dimensions about who face this challenge. And the first is, return to make the confidence in the traditional media and the media outlet. Recognize that the internet and the platforms don't have a model of business that promote the accuracy information. For the contrary, promote the flow information, stupid information, or false information, or fake information. And we need to have a dialogue and press to the platform to change the model of the business and pay better the accuracy information and the information that the media outlet provide and in behalf of the other information. Second, call to the state that not respond for this challenge with censorship or law like allow take down information or take down or punish the fake news. We have tools for when you disseminate false information intentionally. We have standards about that, and don't need another law to punish this kind of information. No? In fact, the last year in Brazil, the Congress passed a very fast law to allow the politician in the electoral context to call for the platform direct without any intermediary of the judges to take down information that don't benefit. And for lucky, finally with the international press, the president veto, I don't know what it's in English, take down the law. And the third, I think that the platform and the media have the tools to provide the society to identify the false news. It's the property society that need to have media literacy and the tools to resolve this. Some mechanism flagging. The technology provide now the possibility to, if I share a false news, somebody tell me, oh, be careful because this is a false news. The checking system now in Mexico have a great job. The organization that fact check the false news or the fake news, a number of tools that permit to respond this challenge, because it's obviously the possibility to viralize a false information is serious. It's a realidad. But I think that's many tools to face this without repression and censorship.
Thank you all so much for being here, for your wonderful interventions, and for everything you do to defend freedom of expression in the Americas. Please join me in thanking our panelists.